Ladies and gentlemen, as promised, I have a very interesting guest on from the Cato Institute, David J. Bier. David, good morning to you. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for suffering my madness and agreeing to come on. So let's talk a little bit about you first. Tell us about yourself.
Well, I'm the Associate Director of Immigration Studies here at the Cato Institute. Many of you may know the Cato Institute is one of the leading libertarian think tanks in Washington, D.C. We research public policy from a libertarian perspective and produce rigorous analysis of government regulation, government policymaking of all kinds, and propose reforms to make the world a freer place.
When you, for you personally, you libertarianism, being libertarian, and I have voted. I think the first time I voted for libertarian, when I would meet with a local libertarian group, was for Ron Paul, 1980 something. And for you, what's that journey been like to being libertarian?
Well, I guess my first interest in politics would have been, the Iraq War, and I thought that was a misguided adventure from the start, and that's what piqued my interest. And I thought, once I got involved in advocating around not involving ourselves in every conflict around the world, I realized that a lot of the people who are advocating for not getting involved in conflicts around the world really wanted to get involved in lots of people's lives inside the United States. And that's when I realized I'm not a liberal, and whatever I am, it's certainly not a conservative. So I'm something in the middle, and ultimately the free market and libertarianism is about voluntary action, people coming together and interacting in voluntary ways, and pursuing the pursuit of happiness while recognizing the rights of other people. So, I've always, I guess, had an innate understanding of that, and obviously pursued that intellectually over many years since then.
One of the things that, and you correct me because you're with Cato Institute, less government involvement in our personal lives, correct? With libertarian?
Yes, that's an essential start toward libertarianism.
So a little bit about, again, you're expert on legal immigration, border security, interior enforcement. Tell us about that.
Well, that's certainly, that's my field of expertise. I'm focused on making the immigration system legal and safe and orderly. I don't, want to see a chaotic and disorderly system. I think the fact that we've prohibited most legal immigration to the United States has produced the chaotic scenes that we see at the border, the illegal immigration, the violations of the law. It's just like so many other actions that the government has taken. Prohibition has produced a black market, and it's made everything worse for everyone, for the immigrants, for Americans who want to interact with them, and of course for taxpayers who are, footing the bill for billions of dollars in border security and immigration enforcement expenditures that are mostly unnecessary.
I appreciate that. The article that I read, and I've got to post it up. Fentanyl is smuggled for U.S. citizens by U.S. citizens, not asylum seekers. And I've got to tell you, when I read the title of it, I had to read it like 3 times because, very honestly, that wasn't what I thought was going on. Yet I knew for U.S. citizens, but I didn't know by U.S. citizens, and I had to read it because I'm thinking, might get, am I reading this wrong or something? Is it, yeah. And it's incredible. Tell me about the research for this.
Well, right. So a big part of, you know, border security is the drug war. Of course, that undergirds a lot of the justification for spending a lot of money on border security. And so it matters a lot where drugs are entering the country, how they're coming across the border. And the fact is that the vast majority of hard drugs are smuggled in legal trade and travel by U.S. citizens primarily. We know this from a lot of different standpoints. So, you know, a lot of statistics, 86% of drug trafficking convictions are of U.S. citizens. If you're looking at fentanyl in particular, you know, so, you know, fentanyl, that's what everyone's focused on because fentanyl is what's driving the opioid deaths. You know, it's the vast majority of opioid deaths in the United States are now driven by fentanyl. It's the worst of the worst drugs. And it's mainly primarily brought in by U.S. citizens. Then there's a small portion of legal permanent residents, you know, people who have green cards, and then an even smaller portion of people who don't have any legal status at all in the United States are convicted. And what ends up happening is that marijuana is smuggled between ports of entry because it's really difficult to get marijuana, bulk supplies of marijuana through a port of entry because it's so bulky, it's so large, it's so pungent. There's a smell to it.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to bring that in, you know, in legal trade, you know, on a traveler. Whereas fentanyl, you can pack enough fentanyl to kill, you know, an entire city on your person. And so the quantities that you're talking about that you can fund supply a very large market with a very small amount. And the reason why U.S. citizens are being hired for this work is because of the fact that they are much less likely to be subject to scrutiny at ports of entry compared to someone who doesn't have legal status in the United States. And so U.S. citizens are subject to the least amount of scrutiny, legal permanent residents just under them, and then, you know, people with some kind of temporary status are subject to pretty strict scrutiny. And then someone without any legal status at all, they're going to be subject to some kind of detention. So they have no opportunity to bring it in through the ports of entry. And so what, you know, cartels and drug traffickers respond to those incentives, and they hire people who have U.S. citizenship because that means that fewer drugs are being seized and it's easier to get it across the border.
We hear, David, from the border security that they're seizing a lot of fentanyl with people that are coming, you know, across the river, just getting into the country. But you're saying, go ahead, comment on that, please, because that's what I thought. Very honestly, because I'm seeing it, I'm hearing it on the news almost a couple of times a week.
I mean, you can look up the statistics. Border Patrol, you know, posts the number of seizures that it makes from people it arrests, and just 0.02% of all of the people arrested by Border Patrol, which includes people who are arrested in the interior of the United States at these checkpoints that they run, which we think is highly unconstitutional. But, you know, they have these interior checkpoints where they're checking cars, but only despite that fact, 0.02% of all the people are, you know, that they arrest have fentanyl on them. And so the idea that it's, you know, that these are the people driving this phenomenon is just not the case.
Which is, again, fascinating to me when I read that, because I had that circled also that 0.02%. Just that's again fascinating to me. Doing the research for this, if you would, tell us a little bit about how you got onto this and how you did the research, David, if you would, please.
Well, one of the biggest talking points right now in the immigration space is that we need to close off legal travel, restrict asylum. We need to make it harder for people to come into the country in general, in response to the fentanyl situation, the number of overdose.
Yeah.
And so that was what's, motivating. I mainly focus on immigration, mainly on the legal immigration side of things. But if you're going to start talking about restricting legal trade and travel, restricting people's right to apply for asylum in the United States, then, okay, so we really have to dig into the numbers. What's happening with fentanyl? What actions have the government taken already, and are they working or not? And it's not just that the government has, not been taking any actions or there's nothing going on here. The government has affirmatively made the problem much worse when it restricted legal travel during the COVID-19 pandemic. As soon as it restricted the number of travelers who could come legally into the United States, starting in March 2020, they banned anyone who they deemed non-essential travelers, which was the vast majority of people entering the country for business, tourism, work. They were all banned. And so the number of trips available to drug trafficking organizations went down dramatically overnight. And the response was, we're going to smuggle fentanyl instead of heroin or other drugs, because fentanyl is the most potent, the most dense, the easiest to conceal. So we have fewer trips available. So we're going to smuggle the drug that can supply the same market with fewer trips. And we can see that borne out. I mean, basically, all that, if you look at the heroin seizures versus the fentanyl seizures from March 2020 to whatever the most recent statistics are for August of 2022, they've basically, fentanyl has overtaken heroin completely. And you used to think heroin, that's the worst drug you could possibly have. We finally come up with something even worse. And the restriction on travel had a massive effect on the market. And it was extremely negative. Over the last 2 years, we've seen fentanyl overdose deaths basically double the 2020, from 2019 to 2021. We basically doubled the number of fentanyl deaths. And it's a tragic situation, but the government should know the incentives are there. This is how it will play out. And that's how it did play out. So restricting travel, preventing people from coming to the United States is really not the answer to this problem. It's in fact counterproductive to dealing with the problem.
I'm talking with Cato Institute's David Bier, and you can go to cato.org, and I've got the full links up to David's piece that fentanyl is smuggled for U.S. citizens by U.S. citizens, not asylum seekers. And again, it certainly does make sense because it's, a little bit of it, they cut it into different drugs. I get the economics of it, and I get that idea of it, as many deaths as there are. And we find out, forgive me for going this direction a little bit, they dramatically cut legitimate pain patients, painkillers off, their opioids off dramatically. Yet we see this rise in all the overdoses. And when you think about some of it, again, they're cutting the fentanyl into cocaine, into all kinds of, pressing into fake pills. And it's killing people. Personally, I know someone who had a cousin that went to a concert for his 30th birthday and died in the hotel room. They got, and I'm not saying this got what they thought was cocaine, and it was
Yeah.
laced with fentanyl, and he just dropped that. And it's tragic, and there are so many stories like that across the country. Yet it's like you say, the numbers are getting much worse.
Right. And I appreciate you bringing it back to this, because this is an extremely tragic story. This is not something to gloat about, a government failure gone wrong, a bankrupt boondoggle somewhere. This is, people's lives are being lost. And you're right, it's getting into everything, right? So fentanyl is now not just replacing heroin, it's getting into cocaine, it's getting into all these different drugs, and it's contaminating everything. And such a small amount can kill you, that it's just driving an incredible amount of deaths. And it's extremely, extremely unfortunate.
Yeah, it's very tragic. One of the things that you had, the DEA reports criminal organizations, again, where we were talking about earlier, this is from DEA, exploit major highway routes for transportation, and the most common method employed is smuggling through U.S. ports of entry and passenger vehicles, et cetera. And I just, again, I think most people, I shouldn't say, I certainly thought it was coming across the river with people that were just coming in, pouring into the country.
Yeah.
And
I mean, the reality is that so much, the drug smuggling organizations smuggle so much drugs and such a small percentage of it is being seized. The federal government estimates that it seizes, and they only estimate this for cocaine, but they only seize 2% of all of the cocaine being brought in to the country. And fentanyl is even more difficult to seize than cocaine. So they are seizing a tiny percent of the drugs that are coming in. And this is estimated for ports of entry, for legal crossing points. They seize 2% of what's coming across. And you compare that to the estimates that they have for the rate at which they arrest people who are crossing the border illegally. It's much easier to detect and apprehend a human being crossing the border illegally, because we have incredible surveillance now. I mean, yeah, some people get across and they do get away, but they're caught on camera. I mean, we have cameras all on the border. We have drones flying 24/7 across the border. So we have eyes. We don't necessarily have the hands to grab them all, but we have eyes, and they estimate between 60 and 80%. I mean, 60 is sort of the low end, 80% is sort of the high end, are arrested by Border Patrol. And even if you cut that in half, you say they're boosting their numbers or whatever, you cut that in half to 30% to 40%, it's still vastly more difficult to get a human being across a border undetected than to bring drugs through a port of entry. And again, the government's probably inflating the cocaine seizure rate too, right? They're like, oh, we get 2%. That's double the 1% they were getting 20 years ago. So at the end of the day, it's just the incentives, and you can follow the trail in a lot of different ways. DEA points out, that's what they're focused on. That's what they believe is the real problem. But at the end of the day, you need to address the other aspects. You're not going to solve the fentanyl crisis in the United States through immigration policy. I think that's the real point, is you have to focus on the underlying causes of this crisis. And there are a lot of causes. A lot of them are government induced. But the idea that, shutting down the border or, hiring more Border Patrol agents, I mean, these things are not the answer. The answer is going to come from other aspects of public policy.
David, again, thinking about that, and that with getting across the border. And again, I don't even think we can conceive of how small. I mean, 2 grains, whatever, of fentanyl can kill somebody, and it's hard to conceive of something that tiny. I talked to someone the other day that said they're concerned that there may be fentanyl on some of our paper money, on dollar. They're concerned because I remember, I don't know how many years ago when people were coming up they were stopping people, and the dogs were sniffing their bills, and these weren't people that were smuggling it, or it was just you get change somewhere you don't know, and it goes through the system. You have any? Does that make any sense to you? I mean, that it could. It sounded a little off to me.
I don't know about that. You'd have to ask an expert in these fentanyl. But it seems like that could be.
I don't know. Yeah, and some, I guess.
That,
I don't
that
know.
could be a little bit of a scaremongering thing.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of stories out there about sort of really extreme situations when it comes to fentanyl. So I wouldn't put anything past the realm of possibility, whether it's a problem that the average listener needs to focus on. I kind of doubt.
It almost made me think of moving towards a cashless society, that if people start I again, not to get in on what are called conspiracy theories, but it's obviously we're moving in that direction. And if people thought they were, again, I don't know where some of these things start. Again, doing your research, what would you say was most surprising or shocking to you? Surprised? What do you?
Honestly, when I went into this, I kind of thought, well, this is kind of obvious. No one's going to be surprised, and I guess it's just spending too much time with this subject. I've worked on marijuana smuggling. I wrote a report about marijuana smuggling 4 or 5 years ago, and I laid out all of these facts 4 or 5 years ago, before the fentanyl crisis really took off. And what got rid of marijuana smuggling, or reduced it dramatically by 80%, was legalizing marijuana in many of the states across the country. If you look back, Border Patrol seizing the same amount of marijuana year after year after year, doesn't matter what they do. And then all of a sudden, Colorado and Washington and some of these other states legalized, and it reduced the number of seizures by more than 80% very quickly and over a short period of time. And the result, of course, is Border Patrol now has fewer things to brag about. They can't talk about all this marijuana, all the drug seizures. They don't tell you that it's marijuana, because people aren't scared of marijuana as much anymore. But this used to be a major talking point for them, and the U.S. states basically undercut that talking point. So now they focus on these other things, fentanyl, and it's true, fentanyl seizures are up, but it's not coming from people crossing the border illegally. It's coming from U.S. citizens traveling in a down on vacation to Mexico.
When you David Bier, when you think about some of the things, again, the response. Well, let's talk about the response to your piece, because I'm saying it again, but I was just blown away by it. I was stunned by it, because that just wasn't what I was thinking. That's not the way. That wasn't how I thought. You had to have heard that from others. What kind of response to your article?
Right. So a lot of it's been positive. A lot of people just don't believe it. They think, well, the immigrants are not getting caught. We don't know what we don't know, kind of thing. And I feel like that kind of response just overlooks the basic common sense that I lay out. The incentive structures, make sense of what we're seeing in terms of convictions. It's not that we have a magic immigrant out there who's so much better at getting away with smuggling than the U.S. citizen. I mean, immigrants are great. They're really hardworking and really, entrepreneurial, but they're not, so much better at drug smuggling than U.S. citizens are. The reality is, if it was so easy to cross the border with fentanyl, U.S. citizens would not be trafficking it through ports of entry. They would be following the same routes as anywhere else, because it's not even a crime for me to cross the border illegally. So, I mean, it just doesn't make sense. If you think about it, you have to, think through the logic of what makes sense from the perspective of the drug trafficker, and that ultimately will lead you to the conclusions that I lay out, which is that this is an issue largely driven by U.S. citizens, and ultimately for U.S. citizens, because they're the overwhelming majority of consumers. I actually found that to be the most surprising fact, was that the estimates of consumption of illicit opioids in the United States, that non-citizens are far less likely to be consumers of illicit opioids than U.S. citizens. I would have thought it would be totally indistinguishable, that there's no difference there. And the estimates that were done, and of course this is based on the grisly fact that we only see this when it comes out at the morgue, but U.S. citizens, unfortunately, are the ones dying at a disproportionate rate from fentanyl. And so it makes it even more important that they understand their true causes and consequences of some of these border policies on this problem.
David, I just want to say, I know you got to split in a couple of minutes, but I just want to say that the people that might be, I don't want to say skeptical or whatever, people that were saying, no, they're probably headline readers and didn't read the piece, because if you read the piece, if you read your blog, then you understand it. And because you did your research, you did your, forgive me for saying, homework on this. And again, when I read it, I was stunned. I probably have said that 20 times already, but I truly was. And again, people that would say, read the article. A lot of people, I don't want to get into a whole commentary about headline readers, but people read headlines, or they would read the title of it and say, no, that can't be right. Read it. And they'll know with the numbers, with your research, with your, again, I'll say homework. It's mind blowing. It really is mind blowing. Do you see any changes coming? Any positive changes?
Unfortunately, no. One of the hopes that I had was that the change that happened when we banned non-essential travel, we saw a shift from fentanyl made up about a third of the combined heroin fentanyl seizures before the start of the pandemic. As a result of banning non-essential travel, it went 90% was fentanyl, 10% heroin. So this massive change in the market was driven by these restrictions that were imposed on non-essential travel. Well, the Biden administration has largely gotten rid of those starting in January. And sort of the hope was, well, maybe things will sort of go back to the way they were, and we'll see a little bit less fentanyl coming. And, the division will be, more 30, 60, something like that. But that hasn't happened. Unfortunately, the way the market adjusted, the fentanyl, the drug traffickers realized they're making the same money, maybe even better money, just going with fentanyl. And so the market didn't switch back after the end of the non-essential travel ban, and that was a big disappointment for me. Is that I kind of hoped that maybe this would subside, and so we're not seeing any reductions in fentanyl deaths as a consequence of this change. And so, from the standpoint of policy, again, it just comes back to other areas. We're not going to solve this on the immigration side. I don't have any solutions to tell you. Changing immigration policy just is not going to affect the epidemic at this point. They need to focus on other measures to address this and keep people alive.
Yeah. And like you say, I mean, the economics of it, again, even the processing, you can make fentanyl in a lab or however, but you have to grow the poppies and then you have to extract it. There's a whole process. So the economics. Oh,
yeah, right.
terrific.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to get away with making fentanyl now. Once you have the capital invested in manufacturing, it's much easier to conceal than heroin production, which is much more intensive. So there's a lot of reasons for it, and a lot of it is driven by sort of the prohibition policies and the crackdown on the border. And there's nothing that that stuff's not going away. It's not like we're going to ever get away with not having any border controls. And I don't even want that. I want people vetted and screened before they're brought into the country too, like anyone. But the reality is that we're stuck with this situation. And
horrific.
My message would be, we need to stop thinking about this in terms of a migration policy issue, because if we do, it will be a distraction from some of the real solutions.
I really appreciate you coming on with me today, and more importantly, the work that you do with Cato Institute, cato.org. Again, I'm going to tell you folks a little bit more about the links in just a minute. David Bier, thank you so much. I really appreciate your work, and I appreciate you, as I said earlier, suffering my chaos and being here. Thank you. Hope you'll come back.
Of course. Thank you. Have a great weekend. Bye.
You too. Folks, a fascinating article. I would urge you to read the piece, read it,